The sun sets on the Castro era. Will Cuba further modernize under a new socialist president? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Miguel Diaz-Canel. Well, the winds of change might be blowing over Cuba's communist revolution as Parliament replaces President Raul Castro. Only one candidate was put forth to take on the top job, a decision that ushers in the island's first non-Castro as leader in 60 years. But little is known about Diaz-Canel and how he will lead. Newspapers portray him as a man who embraces technology and wants to bring greater internet access to the country. But some analysts are pessimistic, saying it's unlikely we'll see major changes to the economy as long as Donald Trump is in the White House and Cuba's main trading partner, Venezuela, is in economic turmoil. So what is in store for Cuba? That debate in a moment, but first, Edis Tianshan has this report from Havana.
There's not a single statue of him and no streets bearing his name. But here in Cuba, Fidel Castro is everywhere. The leader of the country's communist revolution is one of the most divisive figures of the 20th century. When Castro's guerrilla fight overthrew the US-backed Batista dictatorship in 1959, the 32-year-old seized control of the island and implemented a series of socialist reforms.
Ni bajo esa bandera ni bajo ninguna otra podrá venir nadie a inspeccionar nuestro país. Nosotros sabemos lo que hacemos y sabemos cómo debemos defender nuestra integridad y nuestra soberanía.
He became a national hero among lower-class Cubans as he brought in social welfare programs that included free education, healthcare, housing, and food.
We always had to keep an eye because Fidel didn't think much of his security. He would just escape to go and have a sandwich with ordinary people. He never felt the pressure of his status. He would just run off to the beach alone or to the cinema. He remained connected to his people.
Cuba is Fidel Castro's living legacy, and here he's seen as a father figure. Yo soy Fidel, or I am Fidel, is a popular slogan still used to identify with him, and being Fidelista is considered the right ideological way of thinking. And although Fidel Castro fulfilled his promises for egalitarian policies, he did not fulfill one for democratic elections within 6 months. And he quickly became the only option for Cuba. His regime grew increasingly intolerant against other views, and many dissidents were rounded up and incarcerated. The confiscation of land and assets from the wealthy in the name of socialism triggered a mass exodus of middle-class Cubans. Today, Miami's neighborhood of Little Havana is home to tens of thousands of US residents of Cuban descent. Roberto moved here after being detained 4 times in Cuba as a 17-year-old for collecting artwork that was censored by the regime.
Today, I dedicate my life to trying to recuperate Cuba's history and culture predating 1959, which the government has banned, because it's not convenient for them to talk about Havana's capitalist history before the revolution, when it used to be one of the most developed cities in the region.
More than 1 million Cubans remain in diaspora, many of them unable or unwilling to return. Back in Cuba, their departure isn't seen as a problem for the revolution, but almost as part of its natural course. Fidel Castro handed power to his brother Raul in 2008. As president, Raul Castro took steps to modernize Cuba's economy, but he did not change much about the nation's socialist way of life. The state still provides many basic necessities for Cubans. Resources are distributed equally and sparingly, so no one is well off. Merilis is a famous opera singer in Cuba. She leads a lifestyle very similar to her neighbors. She shops at the only food market in her neighborhood, where everyone's allocated a set amount of food rations. And while they're not exactly spoiled for choice, the government guarantees they won't go hungry. She makes $30 a month, well above an average Cuban salary.
Entonces, mira, por ejemplo, estas personas aquí tienen dos tanques y tienen uno elevado ahí arriba. Que si lo da el Estado es una cuota fija.
My salary easily covers all of my bills. And you know, we're all given basic necessities by the state, but it's not enough to fix my house. I just can't. My whole salary could only buy 2 bags of cement.
Exceptionally low salaries have become a widespread problem. A US-imposed blockade has crippled the Cuban economy, leaving Cubans constantly short of cash and goods. And while prices kept rising, salaries did not. For the first time in 60 years, Cuba will be ruled by a leader who isn't a Castro. Raul Castro's successor is a 52-year-old engineer, Miguel Diaz-Canel. He's been with the Communist Party since his youth and previously served as an education minister. He also served as a close aide to Raul Castro. And with Castro still remaining as the head of the Communist Party, many question the extent of Diaz-Canel's power.
The new president, he doesn't have a magic stick that's going to solve all the problems. The problems are the same problems. He is not going to have a different agenda. He is going to have the same agenda. And he doesn't have a magic stick in his hand.
Miguel Diaz-Canel is not expected to make any compromises on Cuba's commitment to the communist revolution, but he's expected to propose economic reforms. It will be a delicate balancing act for the new president to create better economic prospects while preserving a way of life that Cubans cherish. It is Tianshan, TRT World, Havana.
Well, joining me now to discuss Cuba further from Miami is Javier Lopez. He is the president of the Cuban-American Bar Association. Also in Miami, we have Sebastián Arcos. He is the associate director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University. And from London, Rob Miller. He is the director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let me begin with you, Rob, in London there.
Thank you.
First, tell us how much you really believe can change under this new leadership. It's still under the rule of the Communist Party, but can we look forward to a new Cuba of sorts?
Well, I think you're seeing a change in Cuba in the fact that you've got a brand new parliament. There's a very high number of the new parliamentarians are new to this parliament. 53% of the new members of parliament are women, making it the second highest number of female legislators in the world. And many of them are young, including the likely new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, who was born after the revolution. So you have a historic shift to a new generation of Cubans who will take Cuba through the next decades, and we shall have to see how things work out. Cuba faces many challenges, as we know at this time, and it will be a very difficult task for the new president and the new National Assembly to see those changes move forward, certainly in terms of the economy and in terms of continuing with the positive aspects of their revolution, particularly in health and education, social care, etc., that we all know about.
Okay. Sebastián, are you optimistic?
No, I am not. We are seeing a very slow and reluctant shift to a new generation, but this is far from a historical moment. This is more of a show to confound the international community with an appearance of meaningful change. This is not meaningful change. This is not a transition. This is continuity. The National Assembly in Cuba is actually using the hashtag continuidad, which is continuity in Spanish. And they should know what they're talking about. Raul Castro is not stepping down from power. He continues to effectively rule the country through his leadership of the two most important institutions in the country, the Communist Party and the military. The handpicked new president owes his power to him and has a little power beyond that.
Okay, Javier, I imagine you're on a similar page as Sebastián.
I'm a little bit of a hybrid. I think that this is smoke and mirrors. You know, we have for the first time, a leader that's not named Castro. However, President Diaz-Canel was born, he's only known one leader with the last name of Castro, whether it be Fidel or Raul. And yes, are there new members of parliament? Sure, but I see them as puppets, and the puppeteer is and has always been Castro, whether it be Fidel or now Raul. And the fact that Raul Castro is going to be the head of the Communist Party until 2021, I think speaks volumes. So another point that I think is important is that President Canel is going to be 58 years old tomorrow. He was born post-revolution, so it's the only show in town that he's ever known. So how he could even possibly attempt to try and bring, another point of view where, this is what he's been brainwashed with since the moment he came into existence, is going to be pretty much impossible.
Okay, but Javier, let me ask you. I mean, you can say that very little will change because the leadership is essentially the same under the same party and the same mantra, but the economy will have to change. I mean, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but what we're seeing now with dual currencies, this existence of one sort of being pegged to the dollar or euro while the other one is given to Cubans to spend at a 25th of the rate, if I'm not mistaken, that's not sustainable. What's going to happen to the economy then?
No, it's not, and it hasn't been sustainable for 60 years. The dual monies has been around for quite some time. The CUC or the Cuban dollar has been around. I think something that directly affects the Cuban economy is obviously the United States policy towards Cuba. You saw an opening up of relations with the previous Obama administration, and now the Trump administration is now chilling relations towards Cuba. I mean, you've seen the embassy that was opened. It's now, I think, down to about 10 folks that are over there based on, the attacks that were made on the embassy. Obviously, it hasn't been admitted by the Cuban government, but I think we know what happened there. So, yes, something has to happen with the economy. It's not sustainable. It hasn't been sustainable.
Okay, let's see if we can get to that later. I want to ask Rob his opinion on that. I mean, particularly in respect to these two parallel currencies, do you fear, Rob, that we could see a return to the economic disaster that Cuba witnessed really throughout the 90s when it lost the support of the Soviet Union and is now losing the support of Venezuela?
No, I don't think you'll see the same situation. Cuba lost over 70% of its economy overnight with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe, and that is still having massive impact upon the Cuban economy right now. But for people to say it's unsustainable is quite strange from where I'm sitting, and certainly when you go to Havana and you look at the statistics, and at the end of the day we're about people, and if you look at the statistics, Cuba has the best health care system in Latin America, exceeding much of the indices of the United States itself. So, for example, its infant mortality rates are better than the United States itself. Its education levels are the best in Latin America. So while you talk about the economy being unsustainable, there are real achievements, even under that scenario, that the Cuban people are rightly proud of. And if you're a poor person in Latin America, and your children are ill, you look at Cuba and you see that you can get free medical care. If you're a poor person in Latin America and your children want to be scientists or doctors or dancers or artists, and you look at Cuba where children can aspire and achieve those things, you look at Cuba in a very, very different light to how you might look at it perhaps from Miami or Washington. So I think the term unsustainable doesn't really stand up to reality. These aren't my figures or Cuban government figures. These are the World Health Organization and UNESCO figures. So they're the facts, that's the reality. So while can I just finish? While the economy is a very tricky situation, we need to look at some of the underlying reasons why that might be. And one of the biggest ones is the United States blockade of Cuba. Exactly.
Understood.
The most vicious blockade of any country outside of wartime.
It is a factor. I mean, I don't think anyone can deny that. But I mean, Sebastian, I did see you laughing at one point. One of the issues that our reporter brought up in the package prior to this was that Cubans have a good quality of life versus a poor quality of commodities. They can't go out and buy the things that people can buy in the neighboring countries, even Mexico or the US. But at the same time, Cuba, for example, Dominican Republic, right next door, you're looking at 30% of the population there living on $1.25 a day. And I laughed when a German tourist told me that the only difference he sees between the Dominican Republic and Cuba is that the Dominican Republic has horrible traffic and terrible air. I mean, how do you justify that, you know, Cuba's economy is a massive disaster and that the people of Cuba are really suffering when you look at those statistics?
Well, the Cuban economy is a disaster and continues to be a disaster, beginning with the early years of the revolution because of the policies imposed by Fidel Castro himself and the adoption, of course, of the Marxist economic model. The embargo has very little to do and is still used as a red herring to distract attention from the shortcomings of communism and Fidel Castro's leadership. The consequences
why does the United States not end the blockade then?
On the hands of the Castro regime that has been ruling the country for the last 60 years with absolute power. And the dependency of the Cuban economy of that Soviet subsidy became very clear in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cuban economy collapsed 50%. And those achievements that have been mentioned so often about education and healthcare, I am a result of that education system, by the way, collapsed also with the Cuban economy in the 1990s. And that is not the reality that you see in Cuba today. There was a recent poll conducted by a Spanish human rights group inside Cuba, illegal, of course, where 50% of the population earns less than $1 a day. Cuba is in a state of economic crisis, and the government has no realistic plan to fix the economy model that still relies on an outside patron to support the country.
But, I mean, Javier, I'll let you field this then. I mean, how do you explain then that Cubans have such a better standard of living than many of their Latin American counterparts, including right next door in the Caribbean, I'm going to let Javier take this one, including next door in their fellow Caribbean states?
I think that one of the issues with the statistics that Mr. Miller was raising is that, I mean, he said it himself. Where are you getting those statistics from? You're getting them from the Cuban government. This idea that healthcare and education is so wonderful in Cuba is simply a farce. You know, I'm not talking from an ivory tower here in Miami or as a jaded first-generation Cuban American. I have been to Cuba. I went on a mission trip to Cuba, and I saw it for myself. And, you know, I had taxi drivers that were neurosurgeons, taxi drivers that were engineers. Why? Because the average Cuban makes roughly $30 a month. It's unsustainable. So they have to, you know, these brilliant men and women that are you know,
but Javier,
should be
can I put to you that might be very frustrating for those people, but it's not the kind of humiliating poverty that's suffered in other developing countries. Is there nothing to be said for that?
Well, when I traveled outside of it, first of all, I saw a lot of poverty in Havana, and when I traveled Cuba, there was. I don't understand, you know, your question about humiliating poverty, but, you know, folks that literally are, their entire objective in life is to get up and find where they're going to get their next meal from.
Okay, so Sebastian.
That's, you know, it's extreme poverty.
Okay, let me get back to Sebastian there. I mean, the point with the extreme poverty is that, you know, there is a dignity that comes with getting a basic education that in many developing countries children don't get. The level of health is significantly better. Even the World Health Organization doesn't argue with those statistics and in fact supports them. But Sebastian, I know you were trying to interject there. Do go ahead.
Yes, because the World Health Organization and the other UN institutions get their data from the Cuban regime. And of course, it's going to show what the Cuban regime wants to show. My point is very simple. Even if we can define a level of poverty that for Cubans would be sort of honorable compared to the poverty for other Latin American countries. We are still talking about a poverty level that is acceptable because we are willing to accept the total control of a government that prohibits their citizens to exercise their basic fundamental rights. And we're willing to accept that Cubans live comfortably and are happy because they have free health care and education, even if they don't have any of the other rights that other people have.
It's a race to the bottom.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, and let me just get back to Rob then quickly on that point specifically. I mean, Rob, why can't Cuba then really have the best of both worlds? If it succeeded so well with its socialist policies and providing all the basics that are necessary to live a dignified life, why can't it just adapt to perhaps the social democracy models of Europe that also provide for their populations with a high standard of living and all the resources necessary, but give them the personal freedoms that they also deserve?
Well, if you talk to Cubans, and I talk to Cubans a lot, and I'll be travelling to Havana, travelling to Havana on Monday, as indeed 200,000 British people travel to Cuba every year on holiday and have a wonderful time. And when you talk to Cubans, they do participate in their elections. 8 million Cubans have participated in this electoral process. It may be very different to the electoral process in the United States or in Britain, but it is an electoral process, and it is a Cuban electoral process, and it's one that the Cuban people participate in. I was on a program with someone from Miami recently who told me there was no democracy in Cuba. At the same time, 6 members of the Cuban parliament were visiting the British parliament to meet with British members of parliament, the mother of all democratic parliaments, I've heard it be called. They were meeting on a par with members of the Cuban parliament. It is a different system. It's a very different system, but it is a Cuban system. And at the end of the day, it is up to the Cuban people to decide how they determine their country, their government, their way of life and their future. And I would say one thing to the friends in Miami. If you really wanted to help the people of Cuba, which you espouse that you would like to do, then call for the end of the blockade, allow American tourists to travel to Cuba, because it's the only country where American tourists are not allowed to go. They're forbidden by your government from going and seeing Cuba for themselves, and try and end the blockade. Allow Cuba to work itself out. If it fails, fair enough. But at the moment, why is the United States blockading this small Caribbean island? It's a terrible thing, and it needs to change.
Javier, quick final words?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that Cuba is a democracy is somewhat comical. When you have one candidate, you know, take it or leave it, that's not democracy. And, you know, the day that they have the right for free speech and truly free elections, then we can talk about it. One thing that I somewhat agree with Mr. Miller is this issue of the blockade. Now, I don't think that Cuba's economy is in shambles because of the U.S. Blockade. I think that would be arrogant of us to think that way, because the entire rest of the world engages in economic activity with Cuba.
That's not true.
So, but I do think
it's an extraterritorial blockade. It affects third countries. True.
I do believe that there's an opportunity now with this quote-unquote new government to try and engage in new dialogue with this new president, because clearly what's happened in the past hasn't worked. So I'm not for the position to just say keep the status quo. I think it is an opportunity that we should try and use that for true democratic change.
Okay, gentlemen, I am so sorry we're over time, and my apologies to Sebastian to not getting a final word from you, but I think your facial expressions did speak volumes, so I appreciate that. Thank you all 3 of you, so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Still to come, will the rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl force India's government to combat a rising rate of sexual assault? And the UK Parliament is arguing over who's to blame for the mistreatment of children born to immigrants from the Caribbean. There is outrage on the streets of India over the rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl. Asifa Bano was abducted, held captive, and tortured for 3 days before she was strangled to death. The 8 suspects in the case, including police officers, have pleaded not guilty. Nevertheless, some demonstrators are calling for the accused to be hanged. Their anger isn't the result of just one incident. The government is facing a wave of criticism for not preventing a plague of sexual assault. So could Asifa's death be a turning point? Shoaib Hassan reports.
These people are marching for the release of their fellow community members. They've been arrested on charges of raping and murdering 8-year-old Asifa in India's volatile northern state of Jammu and Kashmir. The local wing of the Hindu nationalist BJP organized these protests. The accused include 4 policemen and a temple custodian. Investigators say their motive was to drive out the girls' community, a Muslim tribe of nomadic herders. The crime has enraged Indians across the political spectrum and put immense pressure on Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government.
एक समाज के रूप, एक देश के रूप में हम सब इसके लिए शर्मसार हैं। देश के किसी भी राज्य में, किसी भी क्षेत्र में होने वाली ऐसी वारदातें हमारी मानवीय संवेदनाओं को झकझोर देती है। मैं देश को विश्वास दिलाना चाहता हूं कि कोई अपराधी बचेगा नहीं, न्याय होगा और पूरा होगा।
Crimes against women in India, especially rape, remain a huge challenge for the authorities. The 2017 Global Peace Index ranked India as the 4th most dangerous country for female tourists. The latest figures from India's National Crime Bureau say 40,000 women were raped in 2016. That's more than 100 women every day, 9 women every hour, or 1 woman every 6.5 minutes. The latest high-profile victims include a young Swiss woman, an elderly Christian nun, and an 8-month-old baby. Many Indians, however, are unsure whether the state is capable or willing to prosecute the culprits. Asifa's case in Jammu and Kashmir has hardened this perception, as has another case involving a BJP lawmaker in the country's largest state. Kuldeep Singh Sengar is accused of raping a 16-year-old in Uttar Pradesh, but the police refused to register a case until she threatened to set herself on fire outside the residence of the state's chief minister. Sengar has now been arrested, but opposition politicians say the problem has been complicated by the BJP's hardline Hindu agenda.
ये नेशनल मामला है, ये राजनीतिक मामला नहीं है, ये हमारी महिलाओं का मामला है और यहाँ पे सब पार्टी के लोग खड़े हैं, सब पार्टी के लोग, आम जनता खड़ी है, महिलाएं खड़ी हुई हैं, यहाँ पे आपको हजारों लोग खड़े हैं।
Will this be a turning point for what's being called India's rape epidemic? Or will the BJP protect its own while tearing India's secular fabric apart? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Boston is the spokesman for the Indian Congress Party, Salman Ani-Soz, and in Stockholm is Elsa Marie da Silva. She is a human rights activist at the Indian-based organization Safe City. Thank you both so much for joining us. Let me begin in Stockholm. Elsa, just tell me if the rape and murder of Asifa Bano will actually lead to real changes in India.
I would hope so, but I'm not really confident. You know, it's a very disturbing trend where we are seeing, you know, serious brutality against young children below the age of 18, not just in one part of the country, but in several parts of the country. And it's a manifestation, in my opinion, of the severe, you know, breakdown of the value system that's happening in this country. Since the last major rape, gang rape in 2012 of Jyoti Singh, there has been a lot of change in legislation, but that has not translated into, you know, any change on the ground. Just having strong laws is one part of the solution, but it's really addressing the value system, addressing the patriarchy that exists. And in these kind of gang rapes, I don't know, I'm seeing a brutality and hate which is so severe that it makes me really worried about what's going on actually in our country.
Okay, and Salman, I mean, if you can speak to the argument that people are making that the rape and the abduction of this child is actually being overshadowed by the politics now that have come into play. Is that what's happening?
Unfortunately, in this particular case, and in fact, not just in this case, also in the case in Uttar Pradesh, in the case of a rape of a teenager by a member of the ruling party, who's accused, by the way, he's not been convicted yet. He's accused. I think there is politics. There's a lot of polarization in society right now, and there's, I think to some extent, polarization is engineered along religious lines, along ethnic lines, and that is kind of unfortunate. As it is, I think women and the girl child, they face a great insecurity in India because of some of the issues raised by the previous speaker. We have a societal issue. There's no doubt about it. And this is a long-standing issue. And I don't think we can just deal with one case and say everything is going to be okay. Otherwise, the case in 2013, actually, which grabbed international headlines, then you would have, we saw changes. But, it's one thing to make laws. Then it's about enforcement of laws. It's also about changing how society views girls and women. I think all of these things have to happen. And by the way, this is not unique to India. This is in so many other places. But as far as India is concerned, we've got to do a better job, much better job. We have a long way to go before we can kind of say that women and girls have a degree of security and respect and dignity. And I think we all need to work harder. And political parties, frankly, have to do much better. And by playing politics over such things, such inhuman things, it just brings a bad name to India.
Okay, I mean, Elsa, you were saying how, mentalities have to change. There's cultures that have to change as well. I mean, we said in that report that India is the 4th most dangerous country in the world for women. Indians can't be okay with that. Why wouldn't they want that to change?
We're still not, addressing the core issue, which is the respect that a woman or a girl deserves in society. Right from the time she is born, or even before she is born, she's actually killed. So in our country, the sex ratio is one of the worst, and we have so many millions of men more than the women because of this atrocious ratio. Second is then all the other socio-cultural norms that come after that, which kind of, puts the value of a woman or a young girl, much below her male peers. And this attack, or these attacks against women and their bodies and girls and their bodies is just a manifestation of how we are viewed. It's like we are viewed as property rather than equals. Even though the Constitution of India says that we are equal, in reality, that's not so. I mean, I may be privileged and I may come from a family that treats me equally, but my sisters in India don't necessarily have the same situation in reality. And that needs to change. We don't have sex education that addresses it in schools. We don't have, strong implementation of the strong laws that we have. And we don't have a sensitive police force or a judiciary. And then you have politicians who further their own agendas when each of these cases come to light. And then you have polarization along different lines, whether religious, caste, or class. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and there's no political will, in my opinion, across any political party to really solve the problem.
Okay, I mean, as far as the politicians are concerned, Salman, I know you're in the opposition, but still, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said, I want to assure the country that no culprit will be spared, complete justice will be done. Those daughters who have become the victims of such crimes will get justice for sure. And then other leaders are now actually calling for the death penalty to punish child rapists. I mean, do you think the right response, at least politically, has been issued in this case?
Actually, the optics have been very bad, unfortunately. The Prime Minister was very late to the game. In fact, we had to kind of in some ways, force him to say something. The troublesome part about Prime Minister Modi is that when we have some of our darkest times in India, he tends to go silent, and we need him to speak out because he is our leader. He's our prime minister. He's prime minister for all of India. So he's my prime minister, and we look up to him to show us the path. And unfortunately, he's found wanting exactly at the wrong times, including in the case of this little child. So I think, it's one thing to say that we're not, we're going to have justice at the same time when the ruling party actually tries to shield the accused in these cases, doesn't let justice proceed, let the courts kind of come up with, whether people are guilty or not. I think there's doublespeak, unfortunately, and I think, I'll let it be there.
They say, of course, the BJP response was that they are not shielding anyone who was complicit in the crime, that their people were seen near these rallies in order to keep the peace. That was their argument. And let me remind you both as well that we did reach out to the BJP for comment, and unfortunately no one was either willing or able to participate. Go ahead quickly, Salman.
If I may, just on that point, these are not just ordinary BJP ruling party members who were at the scene of this rally in support of the accused. These were ministers in the local government in Jammu and Kashmir, and they were not trying to hold the peace. They were actually making statements like, if you want justice, come out on the streets, otherwise just stay home. That's not really calling for peace. That's incitement.
I wish they'd participated in order to be able to respond to that, Salman. But I mean, Elsa, let me ask you if you share those thoughts on the immediate political response to the crime against Asifa.
I don't want to get into the Congress versus BJP debate. Let's put that child right in the center of the picture. What was done to her was full of intent. They called somebody from another state to rape her. And it was done very consciously inside a place of worship, which means that those people don't regard their own religion or another person's religion. And I think these are just excuses. What was done to that child, and we are seeing several other cases where, it seems to be like a competition where these people are trying to say who can do worse things to, these vulnerable girls and young women. Let's see how we can be absolutely brutal and who wins this kind of a competition. I think, we can talk about politics and we can talk about religion, but at the end of the day, this has been done with intent. This has been done, with a lot of hate, and that's most disturbing. Everything else to me is an excuse.
Right. There's another issue you're almost touching on here, which is that of indifference in Indian society. I mean, some have said that rape has become so commonplace now in India that it's not even news anymore. And Salman, local journalists in the Asifa case complained that they phoned their bigger bureaus in Delhi to share this story, and some were told this isn't really news anymore, and it took the media months to pick up on this case. Is there a real problem of indifference here?
Well, there's so much happening, I guess, that, there's these rapes have become, you're right. I mean, we keep hearing about these cases all the time. And the brutality of these cases in this little child's case or in other cases is such that I think people have become numb to this. And I think that is unacceptable. We cannot be numb to these kinds of things. And if newsrooms don't find this newsworthy, I mean, they shouldn't be in the news business. This is crazy. I mean, this is the 21st century. India is the largest democracy in the world, is one of the biggest countries, one of the most powerful countries, and we can't have this kind of reputation across the world. I mean, we want India to be seen as a great nation, but we cannot be great if we treat our own citizens in such a callous way. And those citizens who are the most vulnerable, these are the ones who are among the weakest. They come from the weakest sections of society. And if this is the way we treat our own people, how can we expect good treatment outside when we travel outside our own country?
Right. And I mean, Elsa, knowing about that indifference, understanding it, makes your job as an activist very difficult, trying to get attention and make change in this area.
Yes, absolutely. We are working at every single level to educate people on the spectrum of abuse, on the legislations that protect their rights and the official procedures to report it. Plus, we have our own reporting platform where they can anonymously document their experiences. But I would encourage, Mr. Salman, that, we have elections coming up in several states. Why don't you, as your, party spokesman, take a stand and say, we will do everything possible to make sure that within a few years, and not like 20 years or 100 years, in the next couple of years or within the next 5 years, there will be not a single instance of assault against women and girls. I think we need that political will. We need that clear direction, and it has to come from the top. Whichever party is at the top, it has to be driven from the top. We cannot have 50% of the population, feeling afraid to live their lives. I mean, when we talk about women empowerment, or, the current slogan, Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao, those are just words which are meaningless, because at the end of the day, if a young child isn't safe in her home or outside her home, can you imagine if she's actually going to get an education or then further a career or be financially independent or live a quality life? I think everybody needs to take a stand, and this excuses or, throwing stones at each other is...
Let Salman respond. I mean, Salman, can you do what Elsa is calling for?
Well, look, I mean, in this particular case, for example, my party president went out, held a candlelight vigil, and in some ways brought nationwide great, attention, I mean, to this issue. I think when he went there, people took notice. Now, the Congress party, and by the way, other parties, it's not as if we're the only ones out there. Everybody is disgusted by what is happening. And we all want to do whatever is in our power to make this stop. But, I can't kind of tell Elsa that, there's going to be no assault whatsoever. Throughout the world, assaults do take place. What we've got to do is we've got to minimize this problem and try to end it as soon as we can. We've got to kind of work together on that. And it's not just the Congress party. All parties, I think, all parties have decent people. Even the BJP has decent people. Everybody's interest is in trying to make this stop. You're right. We need. It's not that the will is lacking. I think it's just that we need systemic changes. It's not that we can just have law enforcement or trying to create. We have to create awareness about the importance of girls in our society.
Right, Salman.
So I think it's a broad issue.
You and Elsa definitely agree on that. Unfortunately, Salman, I'm going to have to give you the last word because we are completely out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining us.
Those who arrived from the Caribbean before 1973 and have lived here permanently without significant periods of time away in the last 30 years have the right to remain in the UK. And as do the vast majority of long-term residents who arrived later. I don't want anybody to be in any doubt about their right to remain here.
Well, the UK Prime Minister has apologized for the government's mistreatment of Britons born to Caribbean immigrants. They arrived after World War II to fill a labor gap. But in 2010, the government destroyed their landing cards, leaving their children in some cases without proof of citizenship. Many lost jobs and were threatened with deportation. Now, Parliament is arguing over whom to blame. Well, I'm joined now from London by journalist Richard Sudan, whose grandfather was a member of the Windrush-generation. Richard, thanks so much for talking to us. This issue is very personal for you because your grandfather was one of those Caribbean immigrants. He's not alive today, but you've said if he were, he'd be very angry. Why?
Well, he would be angry because, first of all, as you say, he was part of this Windrush generation. Now, in addition to the current scandal over the Windrush generation, that's to say people that came here in the 40s, 50s and 60s at the invitation of Britain, it's one thing that they are being treated like rubbish by the British state, but the reason he would be appalled at the treatment of migrants is because of the treatment of migrants generally, the so-called refugee crisis following wars of imperialism. So he would actually be angry on a number of fronts, a number of levels, but he would be particularly aghast at the treatment of his fellow Caribbean citizens, because it's quite one thing when the European powers went to the Caribbean and took resources and colonized our countries for so long. But then when they invited our people to come to England, like my grandfather, to help boost the labour force, to then, 4 or 5 decades later, because of rising right-wing sentiment in this country, in the UK, because of this, they are now being asked to prove their status when they came to England and London as citizens of Britain. It's absolutely unbelievable. It represents a national disgrace. And I'm going to go one further. It's not enough to have the empty words and apologies.
The empty words and apologies. I was just about to ask you that. I mean, Theresa May's apology is obviously not enough, but the government also says in its defense, some members of the government, that this was more of an unintended bureaucratic failure, not any sort of deliberate racist policy. You don't agree with that?
No, I do not agree with that, because I cannot imagine a scenario whereby other immigrants, for example, expats as they're known, other, British immigrants to other countries, had they returned to the UK, we all know they wouldn't be treated in this way. And actually, if you look at the way UK policy works, actually African Caribbeans and people from the Caribbean communities are often left in some of the most deprived communities. So the treatment of the Windrush generation has to be seen in a wider context of racism at the hands of the British state. And I think more and more, actually, this is how people are starting to frame this issue.
Okay, well, I'm going to speak on behalf of the Home Office and just, to play devil's advocate here, because they say that in deciding immigration cases, which they felt the Windrush generation actually was, they consider alternative documents, including tax records, utility bills in some cases, and that those are relatively simple to produce. So what's the problem here? If you can't come up with those landing cards to prove when you initially immigrated, why would it be so hard to come up with bills, school records, or anything else?
Well, I think we have to look at this sometimes on a case-by-case basis and remember the humanity of the people we're dealing with. There are lots of complex and nuanced reasons why the sudden demand for documentation presents a number of difficulties. Many of these people, of course, have been here for a long time, and of course, records, documents, these things get lost. And so I think it's quite an assumption for the Home Office as it revamps and cuts corners within its departments, to all of a sudden, we have to remember 40 or 50 or 60 years later to demand documentation when, by the way, the parents of the Windrush generation, they had British passports, and a lot of their children travelled, for example, on their parents' passports. And of course, not everyone necessarily always applies for a passport immediately. So the question isn't really for me about the efficiency or the management of the Windrush generation, about how they manage their documents, and it's really about the efficiency and how the Home Office and how the British government is run and how they organise themselves, not the other way around.
Okay. On the Home Office, Theresa May was in charge of the Home Office that essentially destroyed those landing cards we talked about. She's issued an apology you don't find sincere, necessarily. Do you think she is ultimately responsible for this debacle?
I think she and her government are ultimately responsible. Theresa May is the Prime Minister now. She was in charge of the. She was obviously in charge of the campaigns people will remember, like the Go Home vans a couple of years back, which targeted immigrants when she was in the Home Office. So to answer the first part of your question, I don't think anybody who's been keeping an eye on this issue regards her apologies or her admissions as very sincere. And when people get caught doing wrong, it's hard to take their apology as sincere, because they've gotten caught in the act. So it's not she's not personally responsible, but she's absolutely maintaining a legacy of her government and her predecessors. And in terms of their view of immigrants, particularly from the Caribbean and elsewhere, anyone can check the history books. The Conservative government have always been arguably at the head of racist policies.
Okay, let me ask, ultimately, if you're optimistic that this can be reconciled, because it's not the first time that things like this have happened. It was only 12 years ago that the Britons changed their laws on inheriting nationality. Up until 12 years ago, it was only able to come through a man. Women and mothers did not count. You could only inherit British nationality through a father. They've corrected that. Do you think it's just a matter of time before this situation can be rightfully corrected? Or are you a lot more pessimistic than that?
I'm a bit more, cynical. I'm old enough to remember promises like these being made again. And my fear, actually, my concern, is that right now, this is a political football. The question of how Caribbean immigrants are being treated in this country. Right now it's newsworthy because of the whole Windrush story, but my fear actually is that these promises we're hearing right now from the government, from the Home Office, and we're only hearing these promises because they've been, they've had cases put to them, like the case of Albert Thompson, denied his medical treatment, other cases of people losing employment. We will see what their actions are down the line, but right now there's not much to suggest they're doing anything beyond trying to deflect, trying to obfuscate, trying to diminish their own responsibility in this issue.
Okay, Richard Sudan, unfortunately we're out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us from London.
I underscore the urgent need to pursue a rapid economic growth and a trajectory of transformation.
That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye.